gentlemen. This is Nagasa from Sanyii Academy. Today, I just came from with moral and citizenship education, chapter 2, which is about approaches to ethics. As you remember, in the previous time, we have seen about the introduction to civics and ethics, and we have considered some very important lessons that could help us to have an introduction to civics and ethics, which can prepare ground for detailed consideration for the complex understanding of citizenship education. If you are new for this channel, please start by subscribing and liking the video. And if you are already member to Sanyii Academy, start to watch this video by liking and commenting and even sharing this video so as to help other students and those who need knowledge access this academy, this channel. You can also follow this academy through Facebook, YouTube, Telegram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and WhatsApp. These are the social media that you could use to access Sanyii Academy. I want to tell you the outlines that we are going to see in this chapter. There are several outlines that we are going to look at, the more normative ethics, and that these are all the outlines of the chapter 2 that you will go through with me, and this is also the other remaining. So I need you to pay attention. So today we are going to look at lesson 1 of chapter 2 about normative ethics. In the previous time, we have seen what ethics is simply. We have said ethics is a set of guidelines or standards that are set to study human actions, or simply the subject study of ethics is morality. So, to determine the moral value of human action or human conduct, ethics sets standards, principles that are important to indicate the truth value or the value of human conduct. So, I don't want to go to that portion because we have already covered it. Today we are going to see some of the approach of ethics, or simply we can say the theoretical frameworks that are there to justify human action or ethical guidelines. From that, we are going to see normative ethics. Normative ethics. What is normative ethics, and how does normative ethics play its role in the justification of human action, in the determination of the moral value of human action? We are going to see. Normative theory guides us in the making of decisions and judgments about actions in a particular situation. There are guidelines, there are principles, guidelines, and standards we use to determine and judge the actions of human person or the conduct of humankind. So in this case, it helps us to make decisions. We refer to that rule. We refer to that guideline to decide what sort of action we are going to take. And also, we depend on those rules to judge about actions that are performed by a person in a particular situation. It guides us in our capacity as agents trying to decide what we should do. It guides us, it shows us the way and tell us what sort of action we should do based on those guidelines. Because without the help of those principles or guidelines, we are not going to act the way the law requires or what is preferable to the people. We want to know more than just that we should do in a situation before us. Before acting or taking some actions, we need to know how we have to act and what principles and guidelines should we refer to, should we focus on, because those actions should be led by those rules, by principles, which help us to do what is preferable than what is not preferable. Because these normative guidelines or actions, rules are represented as something good, which help us to conduct our action which does not harm other people except the agents. The purpose of rule, the purpose of law, as we have seen in chapter 1, is to promote well being, harmony, and resolve conflict. So, moral rules, moral guidelines that are in this aspect helps us to do what is preferable and good for the people or others. The agent, the actor, has to focus on those rules to avoid bad consequences coming as the result of his or her action. That is what normative rules or theories are telling us. So we have to know what we are going to do before doing it. We should focus on some rule which avoids us to do the opposite. So normative rules need to tell us what we have to do. We also wish to make judgments about what others should do. Normative ethics does not only help us to frame our action the way we have to do or the way we have to implement. It also help us to judge actions of other people based on those rules, based on the guidelines that are already set by the religion or by society or by any other section of the society. So we wish to make judgment about actions of others based on those rules and normative guidelines. We are not only agents in morality, but also spectators, advisors, instructors, judges, and critics. Humans are not only the agent of morality, they are not only the actors of morality, rather, they are also person that is responsible to judge, to oversee, to supervise, to give advice, instruct, and also criticize other people acting. You are not the only the agent of morality, you are also an spectator, judge, critics, and overseer of those people doing certain action. So in this case, we need to understand our role as a human. As you know, the only moral being that is responsible to look after moral rules and guidelines is human being. We are moral animals. Humans are moral animals. So they are both the responsible body that should undertake moral actions and see the actions, consequence, or implication for the rest. The only being that is responsible for anything that happens is human being. When you do an action, you should take responsibility. The blame comes to you because you are moral animals. That is why we are not only the agent of morality, we are also the judge. We are also the spectator. We are also the critics of other people. That is what we need to focus on. Our primary question with regard to this is our primary question with this is number one, we have to say how may or should we decide or determine what is moral right for a certain agent or oneself or another to do. So we have to see how we should decide or determine what is morally right for a certain agent, actor. If you are the actor or somebody, someone else, maybe individual, society, or group, or certain association, then we have to focus and how we have to do that sort of determination, that sort of decision making. And the second issue that we have to focus when investigating and dealing with a normative role or principle is what he or she morally ought to do, what is expected in a certain situation, what sort of action is expected from that person from in that particular situation, and how we have to determine whether that action is morally right or wrong. So this requires further investigative approach that everyone has to take before doing decision or making judgment about that action. So normative ethics at first offers theories or accounts of the best way to live. They provide, or normative theories provide the theoretical account, the theoretical justification that a person has to follow to lead a good life or best life. These theories evaluate actions in a systematic way. That means they may focus on the outcomes of the action or duties or motivation as a means of justifying human conduct. That means they do have formative assessment and summative assessment. There are some theoretical grounds that judge human actions based on the consequence it produces, and there is also another section of this theory or normative theory which emphasizes on the motivation, the principle, the right principle that a person does to do the action that he wanted to do or the action that he uh, conducts. So in this case, we have to emphasize on the consequence, the benefit, the result of the action in one hand, and the other, the formative approach that says the principal motivations behind doing that particular action. So this includes ethical theories such as utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, principalism, narrative ethics, and feminist ethics are category of this normative ethics. They are under the grand umbrella of this normative ethics. So we use these theories to judge the consequence or the value of moral actions of a person. So we depend to justify those actions. We depend on these theories to give explanation for human conduct, which is very important to create whole understanding and decide or determine the value of the action of that person. That is why we focus on these theoretical grounds to make judgments about actions of a person. That is why normative ethics is very important in the social life of humankind. Therefore, this normative theory poses, or normative ethics poses questions of two sorts. Number one, are there general principles or rules that we could follow which distinguishes between right and wrong? This is the first question. Are there general principles that we have to follow that help us to distinguish between right and wrong? So, this is the beginning for the investigation of moral rules and principles. The second question is, are there virtues and or relationships that we can nurture or develop in order to behave well? Are there some sort of character, some sort of good behavior that we have to develop in order to conform to those principles, general rules that are just made or set according to this theoretical ground? So let us go to see the details of these ethics. Of basically this theoretical approach or this normative approach is categorized into some theoretical frameworks as just we have mentioned. Let us start by looking at teleological ethics or consequentialist ethics, which is one of the branch of normative ethics. What is teleological ethics or consequentialist ethics? So we have to get the answer from this detail. Teleological ethics or consequential ethics basically comes from Greek word telos. Telos means result or teleo. Teleo means result or consequence or some output. So this theory is based on the philosophy of the end justifies the means. That means the consequence of a given person determines the way to stand, the value or the morality of that action. It believes in purpose, ends or goals of an action. This theoretical framework believes in the purpose of the action, the ends of the action, or the goal of the action. Because the value of actions are determined by the purpose they have, the goal, the end, the result they produces. It stresses that the consequence of an action determines the morality or immorality of a given action. What it produces determines the morality or immorality of the action. An action is judged as right or wrong, moral or immoral, depending on what happens because of it. The consequence it produces determines the morality or immorality of one's action. One may have the intention to follow the highest moral principles, but if the result of his or her act is harmful or bad, it must be judged as ethically wrong act. Despite you have the intention to follow the highest standard principle, the highest standard rule, if the consequence or the result of following that rule, which is believed to be the highest standard, turns out to be wrong or bad, then the action is judged as morally wrong action. So the consequence of if the consequence of the rule that you followed, the standard that you followed is bad, then your action is going to be wrong. This is the way teleological ethics focuses on human actions judgment. It suggests that the basic standard of what is morally right, wrong, obligatory, etc., is the non moral value that is brought into existence. It is not the moral value that this theory considers to be the governing principle or the governing philosophy. It is the consequence that it produces, the benefit that it produces, the output that it produces. It is not the moral value of following certain standard or certain rule. Rather, it is focusing on the output that is brought into existence as a result of applying that action or that conducting that action. So it does not have any concern on focusing on the principles that you followed, the right principles, the principles of highest standard you followed. Rather, it focuses on the output, which is non-moral in its nature. That matters the most in teleological or consequentialist theory. The final appeal we must the final appeal must be to the comparative amount of good produced over evil, or the happiness that it produces. Maybe in terms of utilitarianism, we are going to see it is measured or it is valued by amount of benefit it produced over the evil or the bad actions or outputs. An action here is determined by the benefit it produced than the evil thing or the negative consequence it produced. So we are going to see the detail of this teleological ethics when categorized in different sub-theoretical grounds. Thus, an act is right if and only if it or the rule under which it falls produces at least as a great balance of good over evil as any available alternative. So, for a given action or sort of action to be good, the consequence it produces should be good. To be morally right action, it has to produce or has to follow the rule that that produces the greatest amount of good over evil. Otherwise, despite you follow some very important and valued law or rule, then the action turns to morally wrong if the consequence of that action turn out to be bad or not good or evil. This is the consequential perspective. An act is wrong if and only if it does not do so or does not produces balance or greatest amount of good over bad or evil. This determines how much the action is morally good or bad depending on the output or the consequence it produces or the result it produces. An act ought to be done if and only if it or the rule under which it was produces or will probably produces or is intended to produce a greater balance of good over evil than any other alternative. We have to say this one. The action has to produce the greatest amount of good over evil to be morally right or morally acceptable action according to teleologists. For a teleologist, the moral quality or value of actions, persons, traits of character is dependent on the comparative value of what they bring about. So the rightness of actions, the rightness of a person, the goodness of a character depends on the output of the person, the action, the rule that it follows. So simple and precise for them. Teleological theories then make the right, the obligatory, and the morally good dependent on the non-moral good. So the morality of the action is dependent on the non-moral output that it produces, the good it produces, something acceptable, something important it produces. So this determines the morality, the rightness, the obligation of an action based on the consequence that are just said to be produced. Teleologists have often been hedonists. Hedonists are those who look after pleasure, happiness. Sometimes it's difficult to say happiness because happiness is mental satisfaction, pleasure, some sort of pleasure that they follow, identifying the good with pleasure and evil with pain. They say if the action produces good, that is a pleasure. If the action produces evil, that is a pain for them. So they are mostly hedonists. Hedonism is a word, Greek word, that represents pleasure. That is just translated to pleasure. So an action should produce something pleasurable over something painful for them. Sometimes they have been non-hedonists, some of them, identifying the good with power, knowledge, self-realization, or perfection. They just also focus on something non-hedonists, looking for good, something good is a power, something good is knowledge, something good is self-realization or perfection or etc. basis. This fact must not be forgotten when we are evaluating the teleological theory of obligations. So we have to focus on this. We have to remember these factors are very important. There are some who are hedonists and there are some who are not hedonists. Teleologists say what is good or bad, and that he determines what is right or obligatory by asking what is conducive to the greatest balance of good over evils. So what is conducive? Which one is which principle is conducive to what is good over evil to balance? So they are looking for conditions that can facilitate for the achievement of greatest good over greatest evil. This is very important. Theoretical argument they present. Deontologists are also another group of theoretical framework under normative ethics. They are simply the opposite of teleological theories. Teleological theories focus on the consequence of the action, the good that it produces. But deontological ethics or theories are different from teleological ethics. They assert that there are other considerations that make an action or rule right or obligatory beside the goodness or badness of its consequences. Their argument stems from the need to look for another lens, another opportunity to decide the rightness and the wrongness of an action, despite the goodness of output that it produces. They say we don't have to focus only on the good that it produces. Rather, we have to also focus on the uh, other approach. We have to emphasize the other consideration, the other lens approach. Certain features of act itself, other than the value it brings into existence, has to be focused according to them. For example, the fact that it keeps a promise is just or is commanded by God or by the state. We have to focus on not only the consequence it produces, rather the fact this action that we are performing is to keep the promise or just is commanded by God or by the state, what we do, what sort of action and response we have to do. If, for example, certain action is ordered by God to implement and then does not produce a good result, what would be the moral value of that action? Should we call it wrong because it did not produce a good over evil? Because God does not order a person to perform the action which is evil, because He is a source of everything according to divine theory, or other states does the same. So, what would be the consequence of action? What would be the moral status of that action? They say. So, this determines and give opportunity for deontologists to look after the action that they are going to look. Deontologists either deny that this characteristic is right making at all, or they insist that there are other basic or ultimate right making characteristics as well. So they want to see that this character, which is advocated by theological ethicists, is not acceptable, or there are other right or basic or ultimate right making characteristics that we have to look to just get to the point that we are doing. The principle of maximizing the balance of good over evil, no matter of whom, is either not a moral criterion or standard at all, or at least it is not the only basic or ultimate one. This is their argument. They say in the principle, which is maximizing the greatest good over evil, is not immoral, this is their argument, or not a criterion that we have to follow, or at least it is not the only basic. There is another principle that we have to focus on, that we have to pay attention to. They say there is another perspective that we have to develop to get another understanding of the action or the morality of the action, they say. Deontologists contend that it is possible for an action or rule of an action to be the morally right or obligatory even if it does not promote the greatest possible balance of good over evil for self, society, or the universe. The argument they present is there is a possibility of the action or the rule to be morally right or obligatory even if it does not produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people or the society. Even if it does not produce the greatest good over evil, there is a possibility for the action to be right or morally acceptable. This is what they say. So their argument posed a threat to teleological ethicists to reconsider their theoretical justification and has brought an obstacle Two, look for another option or alternative for those following these theoretical grounds. Theologians differ on the question of whose good it is that one ought to try to promote. So there is a difference. They differ from them. There is a difference because it has to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So we are going to see some of the teleological aspects that may help us to understand much about how action should be determined and how it should be taken into account. Ethical egoism, it is an area where we see about this theoretical framework, wholly that one has to do what will promote his own greatest good. The self is a center of focus here. The self, a person, the agent of the moral act, is the center of driving force for moral actions. It says one has to do what will promote his own greatest good. So they differ in this way. This means an act or rule of action is right if and only if it promotes at least the greatest balance of good over evil for him or in the long run. For example, according to ethical egoism, an action is good as far as it promotes the greatest balance of good over pain for me. So it is constant, or the consideration is from the perspective of the approach of considering this theoretical framework is from the perspective of self. This view was held by Epicurus, Hobbes, and Nietzsche. They have done a great job to give understanding for this ethical egoists. On the other hand, ethical universalism or utilitarianism takes the position that the ultimate end is the greatest general good. Ethical egoism focuses on self-good, and utilitarianism or ethical universalism focuses on the greatest good of general people or number of people. This is what makes them different. An act or rule of an action is right if and only if it is or probably is conducive to at least as great balance of good over evil in the universe as a whole. This is a position of ethical universalism. This is the good that it produces for the whole number of people, maybe humanity, maybe society, maybe a group of people that we have to focus on when dealing with ethical universalism. Because it says everything has to be good universally, so this determines the rightness of action or goodness of the action that is just undertaken by the agent. Utilitarians, for example, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, have usually been hedonists, they focus on pleasure, in their view about what is good, asserting that the moral end is the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. So they say an action has to produce the greatest pleasure over pain to be morally acceptable or morally good action. However, some utilitarianisms are not hedonists, as just we have said earlier. For example, G.E. Moore and Hastings Rushdell, and so have been called ideal utilitarianists because they were focusing about the universal, ethical universalism. Utilitarianism is a kind of teleological theory of obligation and does not entail any particular theory of value, although a utilitarian must accept some particular theory of value. They accept some theoretical value, but they don't accept all of them. There is a difference here. Teleological theories intermediate between ethical egoism and utilitarianism. So there is a they do a kind of just middle ground, middle play between utilitarianism and egoism. That means good for the great general and good for the self. That is, they try to just reconcile these two extremes to get to reconcile. For example, theories that say the right act or rule is one conducive to the greatest balance of good over evil for certain group, one's nation, class, family, or races. So they also say they minimize, they try to just minimize the spectrum of view that ethical universalism takes, and also want to reconcile the position of ethical egoism, just that the anarchist or rule is good if it produces the greatest balance of good over evil for one's nation, for one's class, for one's family or race. This is the intermediarship of the teleological theories. Apolitical altruists might even contend that the right act of rule is the one that most promotes the good for other people. So, ethical altruists, by the way, altruists are those who try to make something good for other people. The agent that does not consider his own betterment or goodness, rather which focuses on the goodness of other person. We are going to see the detail of this altruism. So, ethical altruism, which is poor or exact, might even contend that the right act of rule is the one that most promotes the good of other people. Altruism focuses on the good of the people than the agent, but ethical egoism focuses on the good of the agent than the other. So, generally, we have seen about the position of teleological ethics and deontological ethics, which is part of the normative ethics, and the way they consider about rightness and wrongness of human action in order to provide justifiable judgment and decision regarding the action that a person does. And we have seen the position and argument of teleological ethics, which focuses on the end result or the consequence of the action. And we have seen the argument of deontology, which focuses on the formative assessment or formative follow up, that we have to focus on right principle and instead of focusing on the output basis. And we have seen some of the important justification behind. So next time we are going to see the detail of subcategories of this theoretical framework with their own assumption. So you have to pay attention to this and you have to stay connected. Having said this, I just want to remind you just to subscribe, like, comment this video and help others to access this video. Thank you for your time. Stay connected, stay tuned with Sanyii Academy. There is more to learn, there is more to follow, there is more to gain from this academy. God bless you. Until next time, bye bye.